Chapter 4, Part 2, Spiritual Suffering. Our culture has not been kind to people who are not average. In other times and places, difference was sometimes seen as a sign of holiness. The fool was closest to God. The ability to remain childlike in the face of an increasingly worldly world made one a special conduit to God. Madness, too, could be divinely inspired. The Holy Fool features in much Russian literature. Some Catholic saints are sometimes referred to as holy fools. Also, Simon and Francis of Assisi come to mind. Most people who experience mental illnesses do not commit crimes, and most crimes are committed by people experiencing no mental illnesses. In the US, we tend to fear people experiencing psychosis and worry after those experiencing depression. We have psychiatric hospitals for those who step out of line or can no longer care for themselves. The idea of divine madness has slipped slowly away from us. After all, madness in its many forms seems so treatable. We have drugs for pain and we have drugs for depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, even drugs for excessive happiness, drugs for lack of desire so we can deny our aging bodies with intercourse. In this environment, how could madness be anything other than an illness? I've known a number of men who thought with evident sincerity that they were Jesus Christ. They were all white men, but otherwise had little in common except I knew them because they were involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward. None of them looked much like Jesus might have looked, and their behavior was certainly uncharacteristic of the biblical figure. Unluckily, the men and women in psychiatric institutions were wandering homeless on the street thanks to Reagan era notions about care for the mentally ill. These are the people who come to mind when we think of madness. Any Jesus who had the misfortune to have his second coming in the United States would do so in obscurity, languishing in a mental hospital. I'm far from the first person to suggest such a thing. It is impossible to estimate how much creative and spiritual genius we've medicated away, incarcerated, annihilated over the decades since the invention of Thorazine. When we visit with people who do not share our sense of reality, our minds rarely go now to a crisis of the spirit. Spiritual suffering is an increasingly alien concept. How can there even be a spirit if we're just brains mounted on spines encased in bodies? If we can change behavior and feelings and thoughts by changing the chemistry of the brain. These days, we might be tempted to see spiritual suffering as emotional pain or loneliness or delusion. It's no longer de rigueur, it has become passe, an historical artifact from an unenlightened time, relegated to communities of crazies who handle snakes or believe in literal demonic possession. As Frankl clearly illustrates in his Man's Search for Meaning, though, there seems to be a kind of suffering beyond physical pain, and more than emotional pain. Irvin Yalom coined the term existence pain. In therapy circles, if we wanted to be coy about saying mental illness, and there are ample reasons for care with this term, we might say problems of living. Frankl might say there was a problem of logos, of meaning. These are all different ways of talking about existential suffering. Of course, such suffering manifests as emotional and even as physical pain, but existential suffering is something that comes close to the core of our being, and while it requires no particular faith structure to experience and no particular metaphysical beliefs, can nonetheless be seen as a crisis of spirit. Existential suffering is about, fundamentally, the same things that religion and spirituality are about. Existential psychologists, admittedly a very small subset of the population, come disproportionately from religious backgrounds and read from material prepared by religious people. Two of my closest friends, mentors, and colleagues come from a seminary school background, indeed know each other from that school. Go-to authors for existential therapists include Martin Buber, a Jewish philosopher, Adrian Van Kam, a Catholic priest, Paul Tillich, a Christian theologian, Rollo May, a psychologist with a degree in theology, and so on. Again, This is because we ask the same sorts of questions as faiths seek to answer. Yalom perhaps describes these questions most succinctly as four givens of existence, four basic facts we must all encounter in the world and deal with in some way, including the choice not to deal with them. The first is death, the fact that we are mortal beings and know it. The second is freedom, and especially the tension between freedom and responsibility. Third is isolation, the fact that we're alone, even when we seem to be with other people. We're alone inside our heads, stuck with ourselves. When we die, no one comes with us into non being. We go essentially alone. Last on Yalom's list is meaninglessness, the tension between our need to see patterns and understand the relationships between things and to know why, between all of those human proclivities and the cold, hard fact that there really is no why. Existential practitioners sometimes think about adding more to the list. Yalom, though, is very readable and beloved, and the rest of us are somewhat more obscure. The most successful at stretching the list might be Lewis Hoffman and his edition of emotion or embodiment. Emotion is something we are stuck with, part of the human experience, and we have our choice of what to do with it, including the choice to deny or ignore it. We could also think of adding pain to the list. Again, I might not be the first person in history to suggest such a thing, although many people would say it fits in one of the above categories. It is something that we all encounter, an inevitability. And we can embrace it as part of life, try to make it go away, deny it at its various levels, or just ignore it. In the end, it's easier to ignore the fact of pain than pain itself. A religion or a spiritual practice that takes no stance on any of these questions is unlikely to attract many adherents. These are the big questions in life. Death, in particular, troubles us to no end. We can take death as a given to include all sorts of limitations short of death, all the things inherent in being embodied in the fleshy vessels we inhabit. But death, in particular, gives us some measurable and quite depressing problems. Terror management theory is an approach that seeks to find out just why and how death is problematic for us. A great many experiments have been done by now, and they broadly find the same thing. Exposure to reminders of our mortality causes us to identify more strongly with whatever groups we belong to, and to hate more strongly whatever groups exist outside our circles. Imagine two groups of people taking part in an experiment. In the first group, the participants are just asked about their views of Americans and about Christians. Then they're asked about their views about Arabs and Muslims. The second group answer all these questions, but they do so in a cubicle with a window that faces a graveyard. Assuming these folks are all average Americans, they're likely to more strongly endorse pro-American, pro-Christian sentiments and anti-Arab, anti-Muslim sentiments when they can see the graveyard. This has been done all over the world, so we know, for example, if we give this same test in an Arab country, the situation is exactly reversed. It's been done in so many variations and iterations that it's difficult to discount the findings. The nature of the death salience has been changed, the in-groups and out-groups varied, and the results are all broadly similar. It seems reminders of death harm our self-esteem. If all our works will soon be dust, what good are our works? If we ourselves will soon be dust, or ashes, or worm food, then what good in the end are we? An affiliation with an in-group helps repair this damaged sense of worth. A lot of death salience in our lives, a lot of exposure to the fact that we are mortal tends to promote nationalism and xenophobia, a circumstance that cannot have eluded the executives who decide what is newsworthy. A primary reason for religion must be to give us either some reassurance about death and limitation, or else at least have some framework to understand mortality in such a way that it does not harm our self esteem. Imagine some of the stories that religion tells us about death: heaven, reincarnation, bright lights, meeting our old relatives and friends. As I said goodbye to my dog for the last time, the vet assured me that my dog would be waiting for me in heaven. While I disagree with the premise, I appreciate the sentiment. The second approach is a touch more uncommon, to help us know we have value, that we matter, despite our mortality. How we deal with freedom and responsibility is also a major facet of spiritual and religious practice. To what extent does our freedom rely on the freedom of others? How much is our freedom limited by interventions from deities? If you've ever read the Old Testament, have you ever wondered about the way God manipulates the Pharaoh at the end of Exodus? Whenever he seems ready to accede to Moses' demands, God hardens Pharaoh's heart against him, essentially forcing him to say no and then to bear the consequences. Later versions of the religion insist we all have free will and that God has taken his hands off the universe. Indeed, our goodness or evil only makes sense in the context of free will, rendering these events in Exodus somewhere between nonsensical and sadistic. It's easy to see organized religion as a form of social control, with sin the central means of that control. In the time of tithing, before church and state were separate, money was another form of control. And this possibly inspired the old nursery rhyme, Ba Ba Black Sheep. In the rhyme, a black sheep is asked if it has any wool, and it says, yes, indeed, it has 3 bags of it: one for the master, the government, one for the dame, the church, and one for the little boy down the lane, the farmer. It might be only a slight exaggeration to say the medieval farmer kept only a third of their production. As I come from a country where religion and government are not explicitly separate, where hymns were an acceptable way to start the day in public school, and the evidence of Middle Ages theocracy lay scattered all around the landscape, it is easy enough to embrace this view of religion. In the United States, as education declines and fundamentalism rises, it is easy, tempting, and difficult not to take this view. On the other hand, research does suggest that belief in God helps people to regulate their behavior. This ability to resist temptation and to feel that life is meaningful are positively correlated with having a faith system. Free will works better, it seems, if we can imagine we are accountable to something higher or that there is a grander meaning in life than just biology. As with anything that discusses religion, of course, the results are highly contested, and it's easier to track down the contests than the original articles. Religion is also positively correlated with psychological well being and negatively correlated, inversely correlated with mental illness. Working in psychiatric hospitals obviously presents a biased sample. Next on our list is isolation. In some faith systems, the question of existential isolation is addressed by having a personal relationship with God, as well as by positing some form of afterlife. We need not leave our relationships behind when we die, but only graduate to more fulfilling, deeper relationships. At the end of many rounds of reincarnation, for example, we might finally be freed from our earthly forms to participate in the grander, universal being that is everything. When it comes to the last of the original points described by Yalom, there are 2 essential approaches we can take to meaning. At the first level, we can imagine we have found the meaning of life and strive to communicate it to others. The next level is to try to help people find the individual meaning of their own life without ever suggesting what it might be. The meaningless life is a painful life, a life of despondency. There are at least 2 ways to understand the meaningful life: as the life that makes sense and as the life that is fulfilling and well lived. The former is easier to understand and might be more accessible to people in difficult circumstances. Finding reasons for your misfortune and the upside of being down can transform hard experiences into learning ones. When your suffering serves to prevent the suffering of others, the suffering becomes meaningful, for example. But a life that is full of laughter, close relationships, and joyful work is meaningful regardless of whether the person reflects on the experiences. As Freud said, live, love, and work. And such a life might tend to insulate us against the lasting effects of bad events. Some religions thrive by offering pre-scripted meaning to people eager to find it. It is easy to be dismissive or even hostile to such practices, particularly after reading the many insider accounts from people who eventually grow disillusioned with them. Dave Elkin's book, Beyond Religion, describes some of this in brief. He's a psychologist and a former minister, former because he was full of questions and his church fired him for not being content with their answers. But such practices may be helpful to the insiders, the ones who do not leave to become psychologists. They may give structure to people unable to find it or unwilling to look for it elsewhere. Despite what non-religious folk like me might tend to believe, though, most religious and most spiritual practices leave more open the actual meaning of a person's life and do more to create the implicit sort of meaning. Friends, family, and faith all help life itself be meaningful without much need to have an explicit understanding of life's meaning. It is enough to do meaningful things. Emotion is tied deeply into spirituality. We find inspiration in our faiths or lack of them. The sadness of Edo period poets is mirrored in the joyful celebration of J.S. Bach's symphonies of praise. Faith smooths over the hurts of life, and those hurts inspire more faith. Think of all the people we've seen on the evening news who have lost everything to some disaster. Have in mind a tornado. They stand before their wrecked homes, wondering and weeping over their missing family members, and affirm how much their loss has strengthened their faith in their God. I've had no experiences I would refer to as spiritual, but there is one that was a boundary experience. At the time it happened, I faced a choice of whether to accept it as spiritual or to accept it as a normal feeling of relief and sharing, and one manipulated purposefully. I chose the latter. How might my life have been different had I been a little less cynical when I was 19 years old? I was in basic military training for the US Air Force. The program was oppressive. It mostly involved standing in line for long periods of time. We would march across the base to a doctor or a vaccination site or the chow hall or the parade ground, and then we'd stand for an hour until our business was done and then march back across the base for something else. All the time, the training instructors, TIs, gave us verbal abuse. By this time, swearing was just starting to become passe, but the instructors called us bad names in advance of us complaining about it. They were definitely not allowed to hit or assign push-ups. All the same, the place was pretty stressful. To compound the artificial misery of exercising too slowly, standing in line most of the day, taking verbal abuse from people of low intelligence, one instructor referred to acne as acme and even spelled it out and said, you know, the place the coyote gets his anvils. Sleep deprivation and so on. It was during this time that my father was busily dying of cancer. Now, on Sundays, there was potential relief from the mindless, menial work of basic training. The men who went to church had this time as a respite. Those who remained behind were expected, in a blatantly biased and calculated fashion, to GI party the barracks. This meant cleaning the grout between the tiles, detailing the latrines, polishing the light bulbs. Whatever ridiculous, demeaning, and ultimately pointless work would motivate us to not want to stay behind from church. After a few weeks of this, I caved and went with the other fellows to the huge church in the middle of the base. Church staff stood outside making fun of the banality of basic training and trying to make us feel welcome. I found it insincere, but went along. Inside, it was just church. But when it came time for hymns, the women and men there belted them out with huge, joyful, ecstatic voices. It was at this time that I felt something inside, a sort of Grinch-like swelling of the heart. I also felt exuberant. I felt at home, nostalgic for the hated experiences of school in England. I knew what it would feel like to know the presence of God at this time. Being who I am, having learned early to clamp down hard on any emotion and to resent programmed religiosity, I sat on this feeling. I pushed it away out of sight, brushed away tears of joy. I turned it into an event in the past, as I tend to do, imagined describing it to someone later rather than experience it fully now. At this time, I could have accepted the experience as spiritual, but I rejected it. Instead, I saw it as manipulation. The Air Force is overtly a Christian organization, strongly preferring its membership to be Christian. You will not hear the story from enlisted folks so much as Air Force Academy graduates, but the bias is palpable. It seemed pretty obvious that everything had been engineered to create that feeling, and everyone else was feeling it uncritically. Maybe it's my loss. But I suspect this feeling is experienced by many people much of the time. This heart swelling ecstasy has spiritual connotations for the average person, has meaning beyond the mundane, a feeling of connectedness, of seeing past the ordinary boundaries of material existence might tend to add meaning to an ordinary life. Encountering and then losing such a feeling might precipitate a spiritual crisis. It seems pertinent to wonder whether we can experience pain of the spirit itself, whether the absence of meaning or relationship or the presence of unscripted pain might drive us to a crisis of conscience or confidence. One of my final clients in psychotherapy was an unemployed woman of around 40 years, dependent and anxious. Her primary complaint was a complete lack of interest or ability in the workforce. There was simply no meaning for her in working and taking direction and doing menial tasks for money. She found her relationships at work unsatisfying, exhausting even, and left every job she managed to secure. She had a valuable master's degree, but neither the motivation, the money, nor the ability to get her professional license. So we started to talk about her life, however, two other problems quickly overshadowed the first. One was her tendency to be the abused partner in abusive relationships, and she was at this time engaged in such a relationship. The man she was seeing only wanted sex from her and nothing else. After getting what he wanted, he would verbally abuse her, once even hit her across the face. She was determined, though, to get this man to love her appropriately in the way she wanted. At the same time, she was in the midst of an intense spiritual crisis, and was always in the midst of this crisis. Her history with religions mirrored her relationships with men, making me think immediately about Lewis Hoffman's work, showing that the way we conceptualize God is a diverse undertaking affected by many variables. What is the point of that reference? Um, yeah, I remember the Hoffman article shows that our God concept is affected by our childhood relationships with our parents. So if our parents are cold and stern and remote and distant, our God is the Old Testament God that like punishes with fire from on high. And if our parents are warm and loving and affectionate, then our God is in a personal relationship with us and is very forgiving. And this person, this client, had these intensely abusive relationships on this plane, which would mirror and be mirrored by her conceptualized relationship on the other plane. Anyway, she spent a bunch of time in ashrams, practicing what faith was unclear. She spent years in communes. In each case, the women were subservient to the men. They were commodities to be shared among the most faithful, the highest ranking men. The leaders used their positions to sexually exploit her, especially when she was young, and then they used their interpretations of their religions to keep her feeling ashamed of herself, isolated, and thus vulnerable to their predations. When I met her, her faith was fundamentalist Christian. She spoke of being, disenchanted with the conventional church, since the latest in a long string of pastors had piled a load of shame onto her shoulders, calling her out in front of the whole congregation. The way she told it, she was undeserving of this treatment, but she had been abused by religious leaders so long it was just expected. But leaving the church put her into home churches, micro congregations who engaged in what they called spiritual warfare. Some of these self described spiritual warriors had taken her in, giving her a place to live and a small allowance so she could get on her feet. Over the course of the therapy, this client seemed to try to elicit some angry or shaming behavior from me. For example, she would arrive with no money for her reduced fee therapy. We only asked her for $10 per hour versus the $120 going rate. But while she stated she had no money, she also had a gourmet coffee in one hand. Two of those would have paid for the therapy. We never got around to discussing the meaning of this gesture. She also tried to get me to read religious literature, and I resisted this, drew boundaries around it. I was quite keen that the client make the connection between her relationships with men and her relationships with faiths. She desperately wanted to be treated well and kept winding up being used and shamed and dumped. She begged her boyfriend, her word? I internally refer to him as her abuser, begged him to come over and see her, talk to her, spend time with her. When he obliged, they had sex and he left with insults in his mouth, and the process started over. When the same happened with her churches, with the force of inevitability, she just did not make the connection. There was something missing from all this. She never described a feeling, an emotion. She talked about being essentially raped by religious leaders, and her boyfriend, with a blandness one might hear from a chemist explaining how to math out a chemical reaction. If she felt anything, it was a secret, and this was the real complaint. She felt shiftless, restless, unsatisfied, unfulfilled, unmotivated. All her feelings were unfeelings, the absence of something. There was nothing that made her feel connected, enlivened, inspired, joyful. Nothing that made life seem meaningful. Whenever a topic came close to something that might be emotional, I did my best to listen for emotions and later inquire after them, but she remained bland, lifeless, unfeeling. Eventually, I had to transfer her to another therapist as my internship was ending, and she decided to just stop coming to therapy. She left a sizable unpaid bill behind her that would keep the agency from taking her on again in the future, a financial block to further relationships. It is easy as the therapist to see everything as intentional, and this act made me more than a little suspicious. Interestingly, her life with her boyfriend improved by her report over the course of the work, and I got the distinct impression that I was changing him through her much more than I was changing her. She reported he expressed more emotions and became more interested in a genuine relationship, treated her better, stayed longer and left without hostility, even started to take her out in public and spend money on her. I kept waiting for her to become interested in the therapeutic relationship, to stay longer, and not bring in provocations like costly coffee and religious material. It was, in short, quite a bewildering, mystifying experience, but here we have spiritual pain as an absence of good feelings rather than necessarily the presence of bad ones. Her life lacked relationships, either with romantic partners, family, she was estranged, or with God. Her life lacked meaning. There was no point to work or even to getting out of bed most days. She was isolated and she was unfree at some level. She could really do whatever she wanted with no particular obligations, but none of those choices appeared to matter in any way. If she worked, she did not have substantially more money than if she did not work. Her degree was wasted. She could not disappoint her family as they were all either dead or did not take her calls. She was shamed by her faiths and her boyfriend and did not know why. Freedom requires not just choices to make, but that those choices somehow matter. And hers did not. Further, she was absent any feeling about her condition, even pain over it. It was unclear if she felt any of the shame others tried to heap on her. Hers was a life of general quiet malaise. It was an uneasiness, an intolerable lack of rightness. Other spiritual crises or other spiritual crises are much more dramatic, especially in movies. We expect spiritual crises to involve pain, despair, grief, rage at a God who would allow the horrors of the world we live in. We do not expect the crisis might involve bland acceptance of trauma, disconnection from one's emotions. One wonders to what extent our disconnection from pain inhibits our spiritual life. Faith has much to do with providing purpose for pain, meaning, context. In this sense, pain is absolutely essential to encountering faith or spirit. Practices that try to cover up pain, mask it with artificial joy, or anesthetize it may distance us from our experience of the divine. Blocking out pain might even reduce our capacity to experience joy. Grief and joy are at least partially contextual. To an extent, they're the same thing. Think of the times you have cried for joy, or perhaps laughed through grief. Inside the body, these feelings are much the same. And it's the decision we make over what we are feeling that makes one joy and the other grief. Excluding sadness from our lives might also mean excluding joy. Again, the best experiences are both happy and at least a little poignant.